story about learning more about the family business from under the kitchen table as a child. So please join me in welcoming Laura.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Cindy, for inviting me. I really appreciate it. And if you had a hangover from last night, be prepared to hear something sobering. So, here we go. Let me tell you about myself. I was born a creative person, and when I was a child, I wanted to be an artist, and ended up being cornered by family into becoming a funeral director, which is almost as different as you can get. Looking back over my life at 60, I happened to join a contest for a free weekend at a writer's retreat in Vermont. It turned out it was a search for writers to join a contest they were having. I took on the challenge and wrote a memoir. I'm better at books for adults, though children's books are not off the table. I didn't win the contest, but I was published. In looking back over my life in a much more thorough way this time, I learned how important honesty, forgiveness, and a necessity of having a really good sense of humor is in order to live with peace in my life and in my death. I didn't expect that would be the outcome. I also realized how much I like history. My second book is a historical novel that I really enjoy writing in bed. If I were to give advice from my experience of being a writer, I would say only do what you want to learn about and love what you want to do. It's apparent you already have a gift if being a writer is what you are called to be. Also, know that when you're blocked, you are not dead yet, and tomorrow is another day that you may be quite prolific in. So now I'm going to read a passage from my book. I'm going to read it quick. So, here we go. When I was in funeral directing school, I lived in the Parkside residence for women and with the girl from Naugatuck, Connecticut. And this evening we had gone to a party given by Andy Warhol. We didn't meet him, but we were close enough. I was 19 at the time. When I came home to the Parkside residence, Jackie was already home. I closed the door behind me, feeling like I had run the bases and was home safe. We looked at each other and started laughing, trying to erase the images that had been burned into our minds. I said, "Hey, did you see the woman with the white makeup and sparkling antennae?" She said, "Yeah." Her face was like a girl from the outer reaches of Connecticut who had just walked out of a living New York City funhouse. Even I was freaked out, and the city was my home. She was freaked out completely. While I was getting undressed to wash up and get comfortable, I said, "After I'd lost you, where did you go?" "Laura, I saw things tonight so freaky, I swear I could only have been hallucinating. Do you think they put something in the drinks?" I told her I didn't know because I didn't go there. And all I knew was that just walking into that place was like walking into a different universe. She never explained what else she saw, or if she did, I have gladly erased it from my memory banks. We laughed a lot about the whole thing and what we expected and what in reality we had experienced. Then we laughed some more. I was sad about Tommy. Jackie said she was going to sleep. I had a journal I was keeping, mostly my prayers, thoughts about God and life, some poetry and sketches, a few lines about when I was sad, etc. I was smoking cigarettes at the time and made sure I always was awake enough to put them out. I had started reading a book when I heard the most terrified stuttering scream. I never heard anyone scream in terror before. It was Jackie screaming, "Hurrah!" I looked up across the room. She had her back to me, and it looked like she was sleeping. Then I felt this coldness coming from the foot of my bed. Once it had gone up to my feet and ankles, I said with all my heart, 3 times loud, "Sacred Heart of Jesus, pray for us." Then I saw what looked like people standing shoulder to shoulder to the left of me, like a wall. It wasn't scary, just a very curious thing to see. I could see rows of them, like a chorus, but I couldn't tell how many rows of people there were. I didn't see the bottom of anyone's clothing, and it appeared they were all wearing the same thing. It wasn't so much the clothes I noticed, though. It was the number of people. There was space between us. I could see all of them, and they didn't end. Nor did they say a word. I didn't see myself as one of them. The last thing I remembered, I was still in bed. From my perspective, it seemed like nothing unusual. If someone were to say to you, people standing shoulder to shoulder, what image comes to mind? Then put in rows one in front of the other, with no end. Then the vision just went away, and a warmth filled the room, no cold whatsoever. It was a comforting warmth, no chills, nothing. Then I noticed I was still in bed, soaked in sweat. There was no way I could think of that it could be explained. It was a personal experience that I'm not sure I can adequately describe. It was not natural, it was a supernatural experience. Jackie sat up, and I said, "What happened?" She said, "I once knew this guy called Feathers." The door opened and he was standing in the doorway. She was still really scared just talking about it. She continued. Then the door completely opened and he started to walk in. But there was this dog with him that ran in and jumped over me. I felt his hair brush across my face and I started to scream to you for help. "What time is it?" I asked. What had felt like 5 minutes had actually been 3 hours. We just were stunned by it all. We smoked a few cigarettes and went back to sleep because we knew in our gut we were safe. I said to myself, Jesus, I had no idea how powerful that prayer is. I will never forget to say it when I get scared again. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And I went to sleep. Over 40 years have passed and I have thought about that experience. A lot has changed and I went on to learn a lot more from school. I can neither deny nor explain it, nor can anyone else prove or disprove that experience. All I can say is it has been food for thought for me for decades. I did learn through much thought about choirs of angels, but these guys had no wings. They were just people standing shoulder to shoulder, rows of people. I now know that anything frightening can be overcome by standing shoulder to shoulder, and anything harmful can be changed to beneficial. I know this from a completely condensed, atomic physical experience of my own. But this is the same principle as when atoms are not as physically condensed or vibrating at a higher frequency and are much less anatomically dense. Now, what about the cold? I have heard on many fronts that this is what happens when a soul passes and needs the energy to make its presence felt. I had never experienced that before, and I have never experienced that again. I can't say for a fact what it was, except I know that I have never gotten so cold so methodically before or after. Yet it scared me into calling for help, but to someone I know. I have faith of experience that his life and warmth is stronger than any coldness. He has experienced death but remains alive and is benign, just a really cool kind of guy. But the feathers part of it, if I look back at what I learned in school about ancient Egyptian death rituals, there is one that says that when you die, the scale is brought before you. Your heart is put on one side of the scale and a feather on the other. If your heart is heavier than the feather, then you're in trouble. What strikes me about this is the large, beautiful scale my grandfather had on the table in his funeral parlor next to the entrance to the chapel and the upstairs. In the United States, the scale stands for equal justice, but to have them in a funeral home makes me think about whether or not I'm doing justice to myself and others, or are others doing justice to themselves. All of our hearts are being weighed even by ourselves daily. How much does choice fall into this equation? The dog Jackie described always got me. She had actually felt its hair. I cannot speak for her experience, nor do I intend to ever say that I know what it was, or go into any explanation about that. I accept her experience as her experience and neither disregard nor deny it. I do know that when I went to St. John's University to finish my Bachelor in Funeral Service Administration, I took a literature class as an optional course. There I learned from Father Robert Lauder, who I found out was a hot stuff author and movie critic for the Brooklyn Tablet, a weekly paper of Catholic topics. Apparently, this guy just loved film like crazy. I found him so cool. I said to him, my son's name is Robert. He looked at me from his over 6 foot stature and said, I'm just a bigger pain in the neck, right? I laughed and I said, yeah, you are. He made me read literature I didn't normally read and don't normally like. But he was just so bright and such a nice guy with the regular sense of humor that could bring me to tears at times from laughing. One day he began to talk about the hound of God. Bingo, my brain just lit up. I learned you cannot say what God is except in description, because when you do, he is not. Tricky son of a gun, isn't it? Look at this, I thought. Someone who loves unconditionally, who will follow you endlessly in devotion, protect you, guide you, comfort you, save your life, care for you, and also scare the shit out of you if you don't recognize it. I recently heard a quote by Muriel Rukeyser. The universe is not made of atoms. It is made of stories. Our own, I would imagine. And with that, I look forward to hearing everyone's story. Thank you, Cindy, for having me.
Thank you, Laura. So, our next author is Rebecca Fryman. Rebecca is the author of Family Tree, Rooted in Survival. Her inspiration came after 8+ years of family research and tells the story of 3 family branches and their struggles to survive the Holocaust. Rebecca.
Hi everybody. Thank you for tuning in. That was great, Laura. Thank you for sharing your stories with us. But I just I joined the Indie Expo a couple years ago, and it's very special to me because my grandparents were from Norwalk. If you are local to Norwalk and you grew up in Norwalk, you might recognize my grandfather had a store in Norwalk, and it was called Newstead Jewelers in town. So coming back and sharing their story with the town of Norwalk is really special to me. So thank you again for the invitation and inviting me to join again this year. So growing up in Connecticut, my maternal grandfather was a jeweler, and he owned Newstead Jewelers in Norwalk until his retirement. But before he helped raise a family here in the United States, he was part of a family in Bad Kissingen, Germany, many of whom, when he left for the United States, he never saw again. It is his story and the stories of my other grandparents that inspired me to write this book. My family stories, much like many you hear about during the Holocaust, are of courage, strength, and perseverance. Growing up, my family never shared these stories. After much reflection, I believe they didn't know how. They never spoke about the family they lost. We always knew through silent subtext that my grandparents had gone through something, but we never learned what that something was. Because of this, my parents did not know much about their grandparents and knew nothing beyond them in our family tree. And that's how it all began for me. I'm a special education teacher. If you told me 3 years ago that I would have a book, that I would have written a book, it would never have been a thought in my mind. So writing this book was a process after doing some research on Ancestry.com. About 9 years ago, I began to see a slew of commercials for Ancestry.com. They made it look so easy. Just type in a name and a little green leaf. The little green leaf will pop up with hints and connections to extend your family tree. I joined sometime in April, thinking that I would have a birthday gift to give in May, and little did I know that I would still be researching for about 8 more years. As I began to uncover bits and pieces of the missing family branches, my research took me well beyond what Ancestry could provide. I sought out help from Polish archives, the Holocaust Museum, Jewish genealogy, document translators, and much more. I found pieces to the puzzle in piecemeal, and with each new fact that I uncovered, I had to know more. My research was not just about extending our family tree anymore. It was now about finding out what happened to the family that we never got to know. What I uncovered was bittersweet, It was sweet because it provided me with closures to answers that I wished to know, but bitter because those answers were devastating to learn. Each member of my family had a different experience. As I put what I found into an ancestry book that was strictly for the family and read like a photo album, it had pictures and documents, it wasn't a written novel, everyone's stories got lost between the pages. So this made me want to write something where readers could follow my family's experiences in a sequential historical order. I wanted their stories to be personal. I wanted readers to feel what my family might have gone through and truly understand that the Holocaust affected real people and tore real families apart. And I wanted to give my family back their voices, and I wanted to extend sharing these stories to outside of my family. So the book starts with the Bronhot family chapter, which is my father's mother's side, her father, my great grandfather, owned a bag recycling depot in Germany. And I find this important to note because so often when we tell stories of the Holocaust, we tell the during and the after, and we forget that there was a life before, that they were contributing members of society. And my great grandfather owned a successful business before it was stripped away from him. The first chapter of the book goes on to discuss her experience and how she was the first one to leave her family. She came to the United States on her own, and the first chapter details her experience, and her brothers and her sisters. She came from a very large family. Her brothers and her sisters, they all had a different experience as well. And so the chapter follows her, simultaneously follows her brothers and her sisters and her parents' experiences. So my grandmother on my mother's side was originally from Ingelheim, Germany. And her story is told in the Mayer family chapter of my book. She escaped Germany on a kinder transport to England, and if you don't know, the kinder transport was an effort to remove children from Nazi Germany and place them into foster homes outside of the country. Some 10,000 children were saved, all who had to be under the age of 17. Many children never saw their families again. My grandmother was one of the few lucky ones who was able to meet her brother and her parents and her grandfather years later in Connecticut, where she met my grandfather. So then my grandmother met my grandfather, and they married on October 15th, 1944. My grandfather was 17 years old when he arrived in New York City. He came to stay here with his aunt and uncle, who had agreed to be his sponsor. But again, he also, as I previously mentioned, he had a life in Bad Kissingen too. In Germany, his father was a prominent figure in the Bad Kissingen Jewish community. My great-grandfather was a kosher butcher before the Nazis outlawed kosher slaughter. He founded the Kosher Butchers Union of Bavaria. He was a religious school teacher and the cantor at their community temple. And again, I mention that because I want to paint the picture that they had a life before the Nazis came to town. My grandfather's also came from a very large family, and the chapter in my book details his experience leaving, his parents' experiences, his brothers' experiences, and his uncles and aunts' experiences. So everybody kind of took a different path, and many Holocaust story books that I read or that I have read kind of focus on one individual and one story. My book follows the entire family and simultaneously parallels. So my grandfather's cousin, I speak a little bit about him in the afterword of my book, but since publishing, I learned a little bit more. His cousin managed to survive Auschwitz after watching his mother die there from sickness. His father also died in the camp. Siegfried, his cousin, survived a death march to Mauthausen, and when arriving at the camp, was brought to a Spanish prisoner to look after him. The Spanish were treated better in the camp than the Jewish people because they were prisoners of war and not just undesirables. He lived in the Spanish barracks until the camp was liberated. He was later adopted by the man who took care of him in the camp, and they moved to France. So he also tells his story in a documentary that can be viewed and for purchase. And so my story contains both fictional and real letters between family members. If the letters were made up, the events depicted in them are all real. All the events discussed throughout the book truly happened. There is one letter in the book written from my great-grandparents addressed to my great-uncle Siki, and that was their very last correspondence between him and my great-grandparents. And my great-grandparents wrote the letter as if they knew that that would be their last correspondence. All who survived made a life after survival. They all married and had children and grandchildren of their own. I can't imagine the burden of guilt that they felt for not being able to get their families out, for being the ones to survive. I now understand that their guilt is what prevented them from ever telling their stories. I sometimes wonder if they would be okay with me being the one to tell it, but here I am either way. The book is not only about the horrific hardships my family endured, but also about the power of light and love, however difficult it might be to find, that comes with the victory of survival. So the book doesn't just follow their stories escaping the Holocaust or not escaping the Nazis, but also having to, those that did escape, those that did leave, how they had to carry on after that. So I detail that a little bit as well. As more time passes and generations are growing further and further apart, it's critical to preserve these stories. My hope in writing my family stories into a novel was to make these stories accessible so that the world will read them, remember them, and share them. And to quote a professor who was interviewed in a documentary called "We Shall Not Die Now," survivors tell us their stories not because they want to weaken us, not because they want pity, but because they want to strengthen us in our commitment to human dignity and human decency, and our commitment to the sanctity and sacredness in all human life. And after they or we finish bequeathing to us their testimony, then the question is, what are we to do with it? Now it's up to us. And he goes on to say, human beings are capable of the most noble acts imaginable, and the most horrific acts imaginable. And the question becomes for each of us, what kind of human being do you want to be? And if I may just read an insert from my preface, and then a little insert from the afterword. And so I go on to say in the very beginning that I'm thankful to have such memories of my grandparents. I'm sad for my father, who does not. My mother, too, has never met her grandparents on her father's side, and my grandfather never spoke of them. Those who were not lucky enough to survive the Holocaust, those who got left behind, were not talked about. My grandparents were too guilt-ridden to talk about those they missed. I want to introduce, with this story, with this book, I wanted to introduce my mother to a family she has never met, and I wanted to teach my father about his family. I would like to provide them with the grandparent stories of their own. Little did I know that it would take me 8 years to uncover what had been lost. And then just real quick, at the end of my story, I wrote, my grandparents never talked about, never told. It was important to me to put pen to paper so that our extended generations of family will always know their ancestors, their voices, and their roots in survival. It was important to me that the world hear my family's voices when it was the world that once silenced them. Researching my family history was bittersweet. Closure was given to questions that had remained unanswered for years, yet most of those answers were difficult to accept. To the family we lost, your children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren survive you. And because of that, we have won. So, thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Our next author this morning is Ken Jacoby. Ken is the author of Going with the Pitch, a 4-part chronicle beginning with the freshman year and culminating with senior year, offering an insider's view of life as a college baseball player. So please, Ken.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Yeah, so my book is called Going with the Pitch, and it's a baseball terminology. So I think as a preface of what my book is and why I did it, it's important to understand that concept. So going with the pitch means in baseball, when you get a pitch outside on the outside plate, is that you hit it the other way. So it kind of means you have to go with what you're given and adjust. And it may not be that pitch you want down the middle for a home run, but just a single the other way sometimes is important. And so my book Going to Pitch is really about my journey adjusting in college baseball, where things didn't necessarily go according to plan. Throughout the process as an athlete, as you kept go up one level to the next, you're always very successful. And when you run into some adversity and some frustration, there's not always a lot of places to look. And there was nothing when I finished my college baseball experience, which I'll tell you about shortly. There was really nothing written of people's trials and tribulations through college sports that weren't a success. You had people who maybe was a first round draft pick or went to Alabama, but there was nothing for the other 98% of the people that felt that were just a good player, but they weren't going to be a professional, and they struggled. And so I had luckily kept a journal really starting in high school and through my college experience. I went to Binghamton up in New York, and when I finished my career, I was working a job, and something just felt like a void. I was always a baseball player. That's how I identified myself, and I still loved the game, but I also had just been through so much ups and downs through college that I was kind of done with it. So it was very challenging. It was something I loved, but also something I sort of hated. And just staring at these journals and decided, let me try to put it together and maybe share my story, really with the intention of helping parents and future generations of players going through their own student-athlete experience that have a bit of a guide. So with the book, I broke it into 4 parts: freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior year. And I really try to track my growth throughout the program. I think when I went in, I expected it to be a really easy transition. The biggest thing that happened to me was the coach who had recruited me, and I think this is the case in jobs too, and I take these lessons with me now. The guy who was really supporting me, who gave me my scholarship, ended up leaving the program. And the new coach who came in had his own guys. And I was just good enough and just enough of a team player that they kept me around. But I was never one of the guys. And I was someone who needed a little bit of coddling, if you will, or just belief to say, you're going to get through this. And I didn't really have that support system. And so every time I took a step forward, it seemed like there were 2 steps back. And I remember showing up, I think my sophomore, junior year, and there were 3 or 4, I was an outfielder, and there were 3 or 4 other outfielders that the new coach had recruited. And so I try to convey in the book a lot of lessons about maturing and communicating and items that I hope not are just for something you can learn at college, but life lessons that are important to transition over. And I've gotten a lot of really good feedback. It's kept me in the game. So I'm about 10 years removed from college now. And without this book, I wouldn't have been as active in the sport. And probably I wouldn't have refound my love of baseball that I have. I'm on a lot of message boards and blogs and talking with kids and players and coaches that I wouldn't have had if I hadn't gone down this journey. And it's been tough. Some people didn't love that I wrote it, some of my teammates and whatnot, which is a bit unfortunate, but I really wanted to be honest with my experience. But I feel like it feels good when I get a lot of feedback from players and of course parents, because I had originally written this really for the players, but the players are high school kids, so they don't read as much. So the parents are the ones who always eat this up, and I have a lot of good conversations with them. Because there's a lot of good players out there. It's not just baseball. Baseball is a platform I use. A lot of talented people that for whatever reason don't get all the break. there were stretches where I wish I was playing and I was on the bench. And I went to Binghamton, as I said, which was really cold. So you're in May doing hours upon hours of work and practice, whatnot. You get to the weekend, your parent drives up 4 hours to see you, and you sit on the bench for 14 straight innings in 35-degree weather. You know, it's not the worst thing in the world, but as a kid in college, it's pretty demoralizing, especially when I thought I should be out there at least competing. So the book goes into a lot of those stories. It also goes into balancing being an athlete and being a student. I used to joke that we're not really student athletes or athlete students, and although we weren't in the big time, we still were Division I scholarship athletes, and a lot was asked for us. And so the other part was just setting expectations, I thought, properly for kids coming into that world, so they knew what it was really going to be about. So I did that. I was pretty successful. I had a good run for a couple years. And then probably 5 or 6 years after I was out of college, I reread the book and thought there was some things that I wanted to change. And I guess the good thing about being an independent author is no one said you can't do that. So I took another year or two and rewrote almost the whole book. Some parts I cleaned up, some parts I added new stories, a little more commentary, and then I published a second edition. So it was kind of going through that whole process again, editing again, and it was a lot of work. And then the kind of last thing I think it's worth maybe hitting on is outside of the writing was the whole marketing aspect and getting the book out there, because I really thought the hardest part was organizing the book, and then I organized it. And I thought the hardest part was writing it, and then I wrote it. And I thought the hardest part was editing it, and I edited it, so I had some help. But that really, to me, wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was having conversations like this with other people and letting people know about it. Finding your mark. In a way, I was lucky, and I am lucky, because every single year I have a whole new crop of freshmen that I can market to. But it's just trying to find the time and the outlets on a limited budget to get the word out. It's definitely for me, because, and I'm sure like all of us, we worked really hard to get to the books to where they are, and we want to see it read. But it is also in part because I believe in the mission of the book, which is really trying to help and guide thousands upon thousands of student athletes, not necessarily even just baseball, who kind of have to struggle and adjust through that process. And I've been talking to a lot of people with COVID, and college baseball season last season was just canceled. And a lot of people were devastated. And what's happening now, which is really, really relevant to this book, is that the seniors got to redo, or will get to redo their year this year, which is great for the seniors, but no one's thinking about the freshmen and sophomores who are going to be more prominent role players on these teams that now have an extra 10 or 15 guys behind them. So I've been talking and reaching out to a lot of these underclassmen who are worried and concerned that their path to success has been really blocked or hindered. And so again, it's just back to the underlying point of my book is about adjusting and dealing with adversity and change that we all have to go through. So it's been a really fulfilling experience. I enjoyed writing it. I really enjoyed being able to stay in touch with people. And the most enjoyment I have now is being able to talk with people. And unfortunately, I'm sure we're all in the situation that life is busy and it's tough to find time, but I still do try to find time to talk about it. It's kind of a blessing and a curse. Is I see my efforts very quickly rewarded, meaning if I spend some time and I go on message boards and post various things and write some blogs and try to talk to people, I'll see the sales go up. And then when I get busy with life, I don't have time, and then sales kind of putter out. So I guess the last thing to wrap it up is I definitely think the marketing part of this is as big as the storytelling part of this. And I think that's really a great part for us as independent authors in this area to come together and try and brainstorm and think of ways to get our word out there, so people can kind of hear and see about it, so these stories can be told.
Thank you, Ken. So our next author this morning is Renice Lada. She's passionate about helping others obtain greater fulfillment and authentic success in their next acts. Her book, The Layover, is filled with inspiring faith-building stories about the restorative and transformative power of God. Renice.
Good morning. Can everyone hear me? All right. First of all, I want to thank Cindy for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. And I also want to say it's a privilege to serve on the panel with all of you authors. So far, those of you who have spoken, there are things you have said that resonate with me, with each one of you. And so I'm thankful for your stories and your presence today. So I just want to give you a little bit of history about myself. So I was raised in Stanford, product of the Stanford Public Schools. And I went off to college in Connecticut. And when I left college, I left with an accounting degree. And I got my first job with an international conglomerate, GE. And I was very happy to be working for this big company. I was able to move through the ranks, made it up to management. And then I was enjoying my career. And then in April of 2015, my life changed. An announcement was made. An announcement was made that the company would be severing its financial services arm. And that meant that my business, the business that I worked for, commercial real estate, would be sold. Well, that was devastating news because I had been with the company for a little over 26 years. And so I thought that I would be retiring from the company at some point, someday. But that was no longer to be the case. And so a lot of people today are finding themselves in that predicament. This has been happening for years, and unfortunately, with what's going on with COVID, this will continue to be the trend. So I left GE without a plan. I wasn't sure what I was going to do next. And it took some time for me to figure out what I should be doing. I didn't want to make the assumption that I should just go find another accounting gig. Something inside of me was telling me that there was more, that I was being released to do something more. And so I took some time to do some soul searching, praying, and just trying to figure out analyzing, I would say, my strengths, my developmental areas, and really looking at what made me happy. And while I was going through this process, I started writing. And I wrote for a couple of reasons. In a way, it was journaling, but it was a little more than journaling. But I wrote out of the overflow of the grief that came from my loss. The loss of my job, the loss of the thought of retirement, the loss of some other dreams that would have been, realized had I remained at the company. I wrote for clarity because I had so many thoughts in my head and I wasn't sure what direction to go in. And so I mentioned earlier that I prayed a lot. And instead of just thinking about what I wanted to do, I prayed and I asked God what his will was for my life. What is it that he wanted me to do? And it took some time before I got the answer. It took a couple of years, actually, before I got the answer. But I wrote daily. And I was given a particular formula to write in. And so my writings were pretty much a format of a scripture, content, a prayer, and an affirmation at the end. And basically, I was encouraging myself. This is what my writing was doing for me. It was giving me clarity. It was giving me hope. And it was giving me help because I was able to get all these thoughts that I had in my head out on paper. And so every day I wrote. And what did I write about? I wrote about things that happened in a given day to me, or a story that I heard with a friend. I wrote about whatever emotion I was feeling on any given day. And these writings began to pile up in a folder on my desk. And one day I showed one or two to my husband, and he asked me what I was going to do with them. And I said, nothing. I'm not going to do anything with them. They're really just for me. And so months continued to roll, and I continued to write. And one day there was a friend who was having a problem, and she mentioned her sister being challenged. And I thought of one of my writings that might inspire her. And I shared it with her. And she was like, thank you so much. This was so helpful. Would you mind if I share it with my sister? And I said, I have no problem with that. And so I got to see through these two examples, or three examples really, that my words had meaning and that they could help someone other than me. So one day I woke up and I decided to put together a manuscript. And I chose some of my favorite writings and the ones that I thought told the story of my journey, of this emotional, spiritual journey that I was on. And I put the manuscript together with the beginning and the end. I submitted the manuscript to two Christian publishing companies, and to my surprise and delight, they both said yes. And so I have a publisher, Trilogy Publishing, which is the publishing company of Trinity Broadcast Network, which is the largest Christian television network in the world. And I was just elated when I signed the contract with them. Now, even though I worked with them and they did a very small social media campaign for me, the rest of the work is all on me with marketing and what have you. And so the name of my book is called The Layover. Devotionals for when you're between where you were and where you're going. And I would like to read an excerpt from The Layover. It's just small. The book is filled with short, inspirational stories. And this will give you just a little flavor for my journey. And I'll talk a little bit about where I am now. So this one is called New and Improved. My circumstances had robbed me of the person I used to be. On the outside, I looked the same, but on the inside, something had drastically changed. I didn't know if this was good or bad. Heartbreaking events completely forced me out of my comfort zone and into unfamiliar territory. I was used to acceptance, but it seemed like rejection was the new order of the day. First, my former company, then prospective employers, and now God. I mean, why else couldn't I feel his presence anymore? Revelation came after much prayer and reflection. God has shifted away from me, so I would have to reposition myself. He was still within my grasp. I just had to try harder and go a little farther to reach him. I felt like a baby learning how to walk. Initially, I stumbled, but the Lord guided me with his hand. He cheered me on until I had the ability to balance myself and the confidence to take a few steps forward. I am on the move again, in between where I used to be and where I'm going, on my way to my destiny. I don't always understand what God does or allows to happen. However, in the case of my layoff, I believe that he took away my job security to show me that he would still provide. He proved to me that the company was a resource, but he is my source. Today, I am much wiser and stronger because of the journey. Have you lost connection with your former self? If you answered yes and have changed into someone you no longer recognize, please don't presume the worst. Instead, beloved, consider this. Maybe, just maybe, God is growing you into a new and improved version of yourself. And that has been my journey. That is where I sit today. Having been sorrowful and grieving over a loss, I have now reconciled that loss. And I'm on the other side. And I know now that I wasn't laid off, it was just a layover because I was being released for something greater. And the book has given birth to a new business. And now I'm an entrepreneur. So I'm an authorpreneur. I'm an authorpreneur because I wrote this book and now all these amazing opportunities have come out of the book. And I've learned that it's important for us to tap into our God-given gifts and talents. And I had this ability to write that people had complimented me and commended me on all my life, and I never did anything with it until now. And so I am glad that I had the opportunity to be with you all today, and I am so glad that I have a legacy now with my debut book that just was released this year in January. And it was released at such a timely and at such a critical time, given what we're going through. It was as if I was able to go through my personal crisis in order to help someone today, because there are millions of people who are being challenged with their layoffs and with the grief of loss in so many different forms. And I'm thankful that I'm getting so much feedback that the book is helping people move through this season of their life. And so I just want to end with a quote by Toni Morrison. And Toni said, if there is a book that you want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, you must be the one to write it. And that's what I did. I did not know what I was going to do over the course of those couple of years. And God helped me figure out what to do next. And it came out in the form of a book. And so I congratulate you all on your writings. And I pray that it will help someone, because as I heard someone say, we all have a story and it needs to be shared.
Thank you, Renise. That was lovely. Our next author is Deborah Levison. Deborah's debut book, The Crate, A Story of War, Murder, and Justice, is a true crime story with echoes of the Holocaust. Deborah, I don't see your name. I mean, I don't hear her. You're there. Okay. Great. All right. So, welcome you, Deborah. Thank you.
Hey Cindy, it's nice to see you again. Thanks so much for having me on, and thanks to everyone for tuning in today, this beautiful Saturday morning. So I just want to start by mentioning that as a child, I always wanted to be an author. I grew up in Canada. I lived in Toronto, but I spent the entirety of all the summers of my childhood at a little cottage on a lake in northern Ontario, about 2.5 hours north of Toronto. And this was a place that my parents had built in the early 70s. They built it by hand, and they really poured their sweat and their aspirations into this place. And it really became a refuge for my whole family. It was a very isolated cottage in the woods. It was very serene, very innocent, and my family really cherished this place. So it was also a little bit lonely, and I spent a ton of time reading up there as a child. And I honestly don't think that I ever walked into the local village library without wishing that I had my own book on the shelf. And that longing to be an author, to have a book, that longing lasted my whole life. So, having said that, I became a professional writer and a publicist, but I never expected that The Crate would be the first book that I would publish. Because, as Cindy mentioned, this book is a true crime story, and it happens to be about a really gruesome crime that involved my family. So what happened was, a quick background here, in 2010, we discovered a wooden crate that was shoved up underneath the floor of this cottage in a place called Muskoka. It was a wooden crate, and we dragged it out from underneath the cottage. It had not been there very long, and we were not prepared for the contents when we opened it. It turned out to contain the dismembered remains of a murder victim. The freshly dismembered remains. So we're not talking about bones. This was new. The crate tells the story of the discovery, the police investigation, and a murder trial, all of which got a ton of media coverage. It was all in the headlines across Canada. It was in newspapers and television and on the covers of magazines. And unfortunately, the whole situation really traumatized my parents because they also were Holocaust survivors. And so in the narrative of The Crate, I intertwine the stories of their past, of surviving cattle car rides and death marches and 3 concentration camps. And so in the narrative, evil in the past and evil in the present intersect, which makes it a really timely book because here we are in today's society grappling with racism and xenophobia and anti-Semitism. And so the book, unfortunately, remains very timely, and especially when we are, well, okay, we're not going to get political. Anyway, people do ask why I wrote this particular book, and clearly I wrote it to give a voice to this murder victim, because even though it felt like, at the beginning of the discovery, it felt like all of this was happening to my family, that we felt violated by all the media attention at our very private little cottage, and we felt violated by the violence that happened. And eventually my thinking morphed in terms of, well, wait a minute, there's an actual victim here, and she has a family, and her family is grieving, no doubt. And so it turned out that this family, was not a family of great means. And if I didn't tell the story of this victim, then nobody else would. The media coverage was pretty skewed in terms of the blame the victim kind of thing. And so I really felt like, as a writer, I had to give a voice to this victim. And then it occurred to me that I could also tell my parents' Holocaust stories at the same time. And that's something that I never had really thought about before. You know, it seemed though that for readers to understand the magnitude of the impact of this murder and this discovery and this crime on my parents, it had to be in the context of their past. And so I chose to weave in that context of their surviving the Holocaust into the story. And of course, I wanted to preserve the stories for the world, especially in this day and age of Holocaust denial, which is rampant, especially online, where people are anonymous and can say anything they want. But it was also a gift for my children and for my parents to write everything down, to have their family histories preserved in a book. But I want to circle back to what I started with saying at the beginning, which was how I've always wanted to be an author. Well, one of the themes of the book is fate. You know, I grapple with these questions. Was it the fate of this poor victim to be butchered and to be hidden away in a wooden crate under some stranger's cottage? And was it my parents' fate to survive the Holocaust when 6 million others didn't? And here I was, a writer who was always looking for the right story to tell. Was it my fate to have this murder fall into my lap? You know, here I was, a writer searching for a story, and then this happens. So the whole question of fate and what's random and what's predestined, all of that really figures prominently in the story. So having said all that, I also have to confess that The Crate was not my first actual book. Because when I was still living in Toronto and I had my first baby, which was about 25 years ago, I decided I would take a crack at writing a book, and it would be a romance, a fiction, and I would write it while the baby was napping. And I did. I wrote a book while the baby was napping. She was a good sleeper. And so I wrote this book, and I finished a manuscript, and I printed it out, and if you can imagine, it was still printed on that kind of paper that had the holes all down the side. And I sent the manuscript to some publishers in New York City, and to my surprise and delight, I got a letter back from Pocket Books, which was a pretty big publisher, still is. And the letter said, well, you know, we found your manuscript in the slush pile, and we think it's fantastic, and you're so talented, blah, 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 blah. Like a really beautiful, glowing letter. It said, we hope you haven't been snatched up by another publisher. And I was like, wow, this is great. But then the letter went on to say, but it needs some revisions, and told me what the revisions were. So, did I make those revisions? Turns out we were just deciding to move to the United States. I then had 2 babies by that point, and moving countries, starting a whole new life, starting a new job, all of it made me put this manuscript on a shelf. And I never made the revisions. I never went back to it. I never resubmitted it to Pocket Books, to the editor who was so anxious to have it. And talk about shooting myself in the foot. You know, I really, really regret that to this day, because it was an opportunity. It was an opportunity to launch the author career that I had always wanted, and somehow I just didn't make it happen at the time. And so it was lots of years later, it was not until 2018 that I finally did manage to publish The Crate. And that road to publishing was not easy because, so I had no trouble at all finding an agent. I had an agent snagged, you know, the first weekend that I sent out a query letter, which was great. And then that agent turned around and started pitching the book to publishers. So she thought, this is a really Canadian story. Let's start with the major Canadian publishers. Well, it turns out that because I was now a United States resident living in Connecticut, they were not interested. Canadian publishers are super heavily subsidized by the Canadian government, and they were not interested in publishing a United States resident, even though I was still Canadian by citizenship. So that didn't work out. So then my agent turned to the big American publishers, the big five, and they were not interested in publishing a story about a Canadian crime. So I was kind of between a rock and a hard place. I eventually switched agents, and that agent brought me to a smaller publisher based in Colorado. Loved the story, put the book out, and the rest is history. And then I now have a second book that I've just wrapped up. It's now in the hands of my agent. Again, I don't know if it'll be published, but it's a fiction. So that very first romance I wrote was a fiction. The Crate is nonfiction, and it's actually memoir. Again, I'm whispering that it's because my first agent said, don't call it a memoir, that's the kiss of death. You're not a celebrity. Nobody wants to read the memoir of a person who's unknown. So its genre is true crime, even though it's also heavily Holocaust literature. But this third book that I've just finished is also fiction, and it's really based on true stories. So I've always been a professional writer and publicist. And a few years ago, I was publicizing some lawsuits for a very well-known law firm here in Connecticut. And those lawsuits were filed by middle-aged men who decided to tell their stories of abuse in very elite, very prestigious private schools in Connecticut. And I read through those lawsuits, I read the complaints, and you would not believe me if I told you what some of these young boys went through as students in these private schools. The abuse was just horrific and unimaginable, and so hard to believe, so hard to fathom, that when I wrote the book, based on the stories, I really had to tone down the truth because readers, I'm sure, would not have believed what I was writing. So I really toned it down, but the book is tentatively called A Nest of Snakes. And again, I'm not sure if it'll be published, I'm hoping. But yeah, so I'll definitely, make an announcement. Follow me on Facebook, on Deborah Levison Author, and I'll let you know if it's going to become a book or not. But I have an idea for another fiction after this one. So again, thanks Cindy for having me, and thanks everyone for listening. And really great to be part of this panel of very inspirational authors. Had a lot of fun. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Deborah. Our next author is Janet Longo. Janet is preparing for the publication of her memoir, Rebellion, 1967, which will be published in May 2021 by She Writes Press, and who was named the 2019 Indie Publisher of the Year. Janet is also the author of 365 Daily Affirmations for Creativity. Janet.
Well, it's great to see you all, and I'd like to read all your books. They all sound great. And Ken, my son was a baseball player in college, so I related to yours, and I might get it and send it to you. But yeah, I resonate with what all of you are saying. I always wanted to be an author since 4th grade. I love Nancy Drew. I love that she was so adventurous. And so I started to write my own mystery, and my 4th grade teacher said I should read it, in the hot June days with nothing to do. She had me read it to the class, which was an honor. I never finished the book, and it was always since then, since 9 years old, I had this urge, this like pressure to write your book, Of course, I never went back to that one, but I was raised in New York City, but on the farthest edge towards Long Island, Queens, just the very last town, all white town, and we had Jews in one part. My neighborhood was Catholic. We had Italians and Irish immigrants, Russians and things. My grandparents were Hungarian on one side, and my dad's were Irish, working class neighborhood. But I had one black teacher in third grade, the only black person in the school, and we just loved her. She was like Mahalia Jackson, would sing at the assemblies, God bless America. I was so proud of her. I loved her. She was so warm and encouraging. So later on in fifth grade, when you learn about slavery, it was like, what? You know, how could you, enslave anybody, but certainly not someone like Mrs. Rusan. Which was strange because later on I would become, a protester against police brutality, which he didn't take to very well. But he was also liberal. My book is full of characters that nobody is a saint, nobody is a villain, because everybody's mixed. That's what I believe. But he was liberal-minded, open-minded, and he left Catholicism because it was too restrictive, and he didn't like their views. The birth control. My parents had 3 children in 4 years, and they couldn't do it anymore. My mother almost died from the 3rd one, and so they wanted birth control, and the priest said they go to hell if they did that. So that was not going to work for them. They became Unitarian Universalists, so very open-minded, and we were always taught about everything's connected and justice for all. So I'm still a Unitarian now at the Westport Church, and it's always nourished me, that faith. So what happened was my parents, who really did love each other, they had a romance, but my dad was alcoholic. He was battling alcoholism all the time, and they were constantly fighting and arguing, and always threatening divorce. And my dad would leave and come back and leave and come back. Finally, they did divorce, and when I was a senior in high school, and it was a relief in one way, but it was also very disruptive because my mother remarried immediately, a guy we never knew, and then after a couple months in the summer, divorced him, and then she wanted to reconcile with my father. So it was just too confusing. I was just about to start college, and I felt they were all, so involved with themselves. And here I am. I was an honor student all these years and ready to go to college, and it was like, oh, you'll just make it on your own. I felt very, angry, and I said, I want to live on my own. I was only 17. So they said, okay. They put us up in an apartment, my 16-year-old sister and me, in our own apartment, a studio apartment in the same building. So it was a very confusing time, and I didn't like school. I had to commute into Manhattan, Upper West Side from Jamaica, Queens, and it was like 2 or 3 hours a day in the subway. It was just really not fun. Also, I couldn't get to make friends so far away. So I left school, and then I went on an adventure. I met a musician, an artist. I studied art, and I had relationships during this year with black people who were actually my mentors and my friends. I had a friend from high school, and he introduced me to an activist, so I began to work on civil rights and the war on poverty. And so it was the Great Society, it was called. And so there were a lot of wonderful things that year, adventures, meeting people. But it was a year of rebellion. It was the students rebelling, the sexual revolution, the women's revolution, and of course civil rights. And Martin Luther King was my hero at the time, and I loved his peaceful resistance. I marched with him. I heard him speak in person at Riverside Church, marched to the UN for peace with him. So it was a wonderful time that way, but it was heartbreaking because I made, choices, and I take agency in the choices I made. They weren't all good, and I understand why. I was, in a confused, very broken kind of situation. So I ran away with a black saxophone player, young guy, just like me, 18 years old. and it was a disaster from beginning to end. We had no money. We're traveling with no money, so it was. I was homeless, almost homeless. Never slept in the street, but got very close. So it was. We wound up in the East Village in the summer of love. So it was just a strange thing. And the weird thing was that as I was living through all this very stressful time, um, I was also thinking this would be great material for my book. I was writing journals all the time, and the same way some of you mentioned, to try to figure things out, to get your emotions straight. What should I do? What direction should I take? And so I did get out of it, and I learned things. I learned how poor people live. I learned what it was like to not have a dime to even get a job. When you get a job, you have to dress in a certain way. So I learned about poverty. I learned about how people live, other cultures. So it was quite enriching, and about the problems of the heart. And one of the reasons I wrote the book was so that other people, and someone else mentioned this too, would know what adversity is like. We all go through things. It's not a competition, but we go through things, and we need to get over them, and we need help getting over them. And sometimes sometimes seeing other people who've been through things that were really, really hard, but they pulled through. And that resilience is so important. And so I wanted, especially for young girls, to go through this, to understand that they often, there's so much suicide among young people who can't see beyond the problem. So I wanted them to be able to understand you could live a beautiful life after that. Everything was fine, and I did have a breakdown after that year. I took a psychedelic drug, again a dumb move, that set me off and ruined my life for another 2 years. But then I said, done with this, totally done with this, and I totally recovered, and went back to college, got a degree, met a man I love. We're still married now. We're together 45 years. We have a son, and he's got a baby and a wife, and so it's I had a whole career in the arts and teaching, and it was I've had a wonderful life, a blessed life, traveling, lived in Europe. So you can totally recover and get back to your true self, as I call it. So about the writing, I agree with what Ken said about the stages, and I love all the parts. I love the creative writing. I love the just throwing it all out on the page, just all your ideas. That's really fun, that kind of brainstorming. But I also love the editing. I've come to love the editing because it's like you're really polishing something, and really polishing and bringing out, taking away the weeds and making the flowers pop, and clarifying what you're saying and your theme. I worked in writers' groups. I recommend that. The Fairfield County Writers Group, founded by two women, this fabulous group. And they told me when I worked with them, I had worked with another mentor before that for 4 years, a writing group with Patrick McCord. And he helped me structure the book, and I wrote my first draft. I wanted to just backtrack. I had written this. This happened in 1966, 67. This year I write about, and I took the journals 12 years later. But 12 years later, I put it into a story, and then my son was born, so I put it away for another few decades under the bed. And finally, I said, that book has some potential. That's a pretty good story. So I brought it out, and Patrick McCord helped me put it into one story. And then I worked on it in the women's writers group, the Fairfield County Writers Group. And they introduced me to She Writes Press. So it's indie author, meaning that it's in between the two. It's hybrid. It's not the regular, standard, traditional publishing house, which often can be very hard to get into. And it's not just, taking it to a printer to print it yourself or putting it on Kindle where it just goes up by itself, which all those options are fine too, for whatever works for you. But I like this because they did vet. They only took 15% of who submitted, so they do try to find quality. They did take mine, and they've been winning awards for book covers and getting their books into review. So again, what Ken had said, that the marketing is a very important part because that's how we get the book into readers' hands. It wasn't only therapy for me; it was partly therapy. Nothing wrong with that, but it was also my desire to help other people understand what it's like to go through things and get over them. So I love this publisher. It's She Writes Press. It is only for women, but there's another branch that does, that does take books by men, Book Sparks Press. But I'm in the She Writes Press part, and so far they've been wonderful. I have a publicist. I did a lot of publicizing of this event. Did anybody else do that? Did you all send out to everybody? Yes. So that's that's why I thank the library so much for doing these events for us, Cindy and Sally. And it's just great because they're an event that it's an excuse for us to tell people, hey, I'm speaking about my book. And but I do hope to get the word out, and I like to speak about the whole process. And I think that's mainly what I wanted to talk about. So just how important it is to follow your childhood dream. If you have that urge, whatever it is, but for us, a lot of us, it was writing. And to honor that we are writers and we have a story to tell. So it's also interesting to me how timely my book is now, Rebellion 1967, when we have the same kind of protests now, the student protests and protests against racism. And I think it's very important, and I think it's a timely book, and we have to keep fighting that fight. So thank you for listening and for telling us all your stories.
Thank you, Janet. We look forward to the release of your book, of your new book. So our next author is Tori Stetson. Tori has written an informative, insightful, and often humorous book, Lipstick Lawyerisms of a Work-at-Home Mom, which dives into women's issues. Welcome, Tori.
Thank you. I'm going to start off by telling you that my children were really quiet for the first hour and a half of this, but I'm hearing them a lot now. So hopefully they will remain relatively quiet. But so thank you all for having me, and I just want to say it's been really, really cool to listen to all of your stories because though we all seem to be from such different backgrounds, it really seems like we have so much in common as far as like our writing experiences and where our writing comes from and what it does to serve us ourselves as human beings. So thank you all for sharing your stories because it's really interesting to hear all the different perspectives from all of you guys. You can all hear me, right? Okay, just making sure. Okay, so my book is called Lipstick Lawyerisms of a Work-at-Home Mom. It's a book that, like others in this group, I wrote when my children were infants and I was stirring and needing to do something. And I wouldn't say wrote it, that's when it began, and I'll get into that a little bit more. But I'm going to start with a quote that's in the very beginning of the book. This is my not for resale watermark book that I have all posted up because it was just released on Thursday, so my author copies are in the mail. And it's my very first experience with this, so it's still very much a growing and learning experience. As you all know, there's quite a bit of learning with publishing your first book. But I'm just going to start with one really brief quote that I have in the very beginning of the book, and it is, telling stories of self-debauchery and making a spectacle of oneself is never narcissistic. I think as a writer, I have always felt, a part of my struggle, I think, is that when I'm putting my story and my experiences out there, I always wonder if it comes off like I think that I'm more important than other people in sharing, like this is not, like I want people to buy me, basically. So I think it's something that I always have struggled with, and so I just thought it was fitting to start the book with that quote there. So a little bit about me. I am an author, very first-time author, and a lawyer. I've been practicing since 2012 when I graduated law school, but it's been a bit of a roller coaster ride as far as what I've been doing for work and what I've been doing family. It's always evolving and always changing, and that's sort of where this book began, because it really talks about embracing the change and embracing the evolution of your career. So I'm going to go ahead and share with you a couple excerpts from the book. The first is going to be just a brief quote about who the book is intended for. It's a part story of myself, a woman, an attorney, a young mom, part history of how we as women got here, part history of women in the legal profession and the workforce at large, and part statistical analysis of present-day women working tirelessly to achieve the impossible. So that's where the book began, and like so many people in this group, talking about, you know, did I intend to write a book? What did I always think I wanted to be an author? And the answer is no, basically. It started as I said before, started when my kids were infants, as a diary, blog posts, just like me writing things down in the middle of the night, and it ended up becoming a book later on. So with that, I'm going to share another little excerpt about how the book began. Some of this book was written in the bubble bath, complete with foam letters, a seaplane, and a couple of floating cars. Because, let's be honest, no one has the energy to take the toys out after a long day home with the kids. Some of this book was written in the middle of the night on my smartphone while trying to nurse my daughter back to sleep. Some of it was written during the rare occasions when both kids were napping at the same time. And even still more of it was written at the gym, on a treadmill, or in between weight sets. Life carried on and required frequent breaks from writing, weaning from breastfeeding, selling our home, and then moving, dealing with family illness, changing jobs, changing babysitters. But in the end, this book, my third baby, well, fourth if you include my neediest baby of all, my husband, persevered. This is the life of an attorney turned work-at-home mom who was trying to make having it all a reality, realizing somewhere along the way that while having it all simultaneously was the goal, having a little bit of everything is just as good. So, with that being said, just going back to the quote that Cindy said earlier about the 3 rules for writing, and how basically there's no rules at all. And that's sort of how I began this book, because I started thinking, okay, so if I'm going to turn this into a book, I am a lawyer, so I've written, I know how to write, but I don't have any formal creative writing experience, and to be really honest, I'm really not a grammar perfectionist. I rely a lot on computer programs for that. So I wasn't sure how it was going to turn out, but from that, my writing style evolved, and it started as a writing style that had developed throughout my years of school, a sort of essay type writing style. But then I started reading it, and this is my process of nonfiction writing, started reading it and thinking, no one's going to want to read this. So I began to turn it into a conversational style of writing, where it was as if I was having a conversation with a girlfriend about these topics that are so important to us. And I developed my own unique writing style that probably doesn't fit any of the rules that people learn in writing and putting a book together, but it works for me, and I think that it makes it very readable, and it has a lot of, sort of essay type background of women in the law and women in corporations and women in business, and the struggle between being a stay-at-home mom and a working mom, but pieced in between, it's stories of my experiences, and a lot of more fun and entertaining aspects. So that's sort of how how I came to write this book, and it's interesting now that I've completed this one, it makes me think, okay, so maybe I can bounce into fiction and try like an art story arc. So I've never done that before. It's great, it's goal setting, and it's growing as a person, and it's been a really sort of enjoyable process for me. So I'm just going to read one more excerpt from it that I actually in the process of producing an audiobook version of it, I found this amazing narrator that does excellent voices, and when I read this, it's always disappointing to me because I feel like I can't read it as well as she can. But when I was listening to her read this part, I was like, this is awesome. Like I just like I'm so happy that I'm putting this out there for the world. So, have you ever dreamed of taking your babies to play at the beach, only to realize once you get there that taking babies to the beach is absolutely horrible? Not only do you incessantly have to reapply sunscreen to their sensitive skin, so their sensitive skin doesn't get torched by the sun, but you also find yourself completely drowning in sand. Eventually, someone gets sand on their little fingers and your worst nightmare happens. Not only are they eating sand, but it is in their eyes. I wondered if my practice would be like going to the beach with babies. It seems like a great idea at first, and even provides moments of enjoyment, but quickly turns into the worst decision you've ever made. I mentioned to a good friend in a sentence how I was feeling with regard to my life and career up until this point. Her response would stay with me for a long time. I'm almost 30 years old, and I don't know what I want to do with my life. Yes, you do. You want to be a mom. And she was right. The only thing I've ever known for sure was that I wanted to be a mom. Like many women, if not most, I have always felt as if this is what I was put on earth to do. If nothing else panned out, as long as I had children, I could leave this world satisfied that my life had purpose. I had succeeded in contributing to the overpopulation of the world by having bouncing little babies. If you want something bad enough, you'll make it happen, right? My business wasn't growing as I had initially envisioned because I didn't want it to. Another great thing about running a business out of your home is that you can let the flame burn out on its own without really making a conscious effort to close it down. An invisible closed for business sign slowly made its way above my shingle, and I quietly and graciously threw in the towel. Yes, I quit. Kristen Van Ogtrop and Just Let Me Lie Down made light of the term quitters never win. It's a phrase we were taught as kids, yet maybe we ought to rethink it. Quitters do, in fact, often win. They win by eliminating toxic jobs from the day-to-day operation of their lives. I wouldn't say my practice was toxic, but I wasn't exactly happy. I will be the first to admit that it took a bit of convincing on the part of my husband for me to embark on the solo practice journey. It felt like a last resort. I didn't want to physically go to work, but I wanted to contribute financially to our family. A solo practice appeared to be the answer. It was enormously rewarding at times, increasingly stressful at times, and defeating most of the time. In the end, I can say that no, I did not 100% enjoy being a stay-at-home part-time solo practitioner, but from that choice came a blog that evolved from strict business topics to topics that were extremely personal and dear to my heart. I wrote about the law with relation to my practice, then I wrote about related current events, then I wrote about my experiences and my struggles. As it evolved, I realized more and more that my passion was not necessarily the practice of law, but in expanding my knowledge, sharing my experiences, and helping others by doing so. These experiences, I began to realize, were not just my experiences, but also the experiences of many other women professionals, and other women professionals who are also moms. In law school, I was able to explore topics within subjects that interested me and found myself writing about women and children often. Women in negotiation, women's reproductive rights, and the development of the law with regard to new assistive medical technologies, education law, and domestic violence. Even still, these subjects and the required writing style were structured and pointed. My blog was different. It removed the limitations from my writing, enabled me creative freedom. It provided a platform that would eventually lead to a post called My Work, My Life, My Balance. This is the post that later turned into this book. My world, my mind, my creativity had just exploded. I had discovered something extraordinary, so extraordinary that I almost felt compelled to shave my legs, put on my fanciest yoga pants, and break out the Prosecco. Could this be it? Could this be what I was waiting for all along? I was redistributing my skills in a way that was beneficial and fulfilling for me. And isn't that what it's all about? We ought to be fueled by passions rather than by fear. This fuel will lead to change that should be embraced rather than avoided in order for us to evolve as a society. We, as women, are seeking to progress in our homes, in our careers, and in our pockets. Change is necessary component to progress. So it follows that we must change to enable such progress, to enable us as women to evolve in our society. So that, in a nutshell, is sort of where the book came from. And like I said, I have been just going through the process of self-publishing this week. So it's a unique perspective for me because it's a brand new perspective. But I'm really loving the process, and I'm looking forward to writing the follow-up of it, as I've already started a little bit, just because the perspective of this particular book is from when my babies were infants. So there's a natural second book probably in the works already. So thank you all for listening, and follow me on Facebook, and it's at Tori Stetson Writes, WRITES.
Thank you so much, Tori. I had a message from Janet Mwanga. She is asked me if she could read an excerpt from her book that she had not read when she did her presentation. So we welcome Janet back.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a couple of people who joined the panel, so for them and for you, I hope you like it. It's an excerpt with a boyfriend I had. His name is Don, and he took me dancing. Kind of represents the era, I think. We descended steps to a new universe, a dimly lit dance floor where colored lights twinkled in the high ceiling and loud piping music bounced off glossy black walls in a large industrial space transformed by artists. Tangled with wires and pipes, the room looked like a big riverboat, powered by heat from bodies in motion and ready to sail on the rhythms of my favorite soul and rock artists, the Four Tops, Stevie Wonder, Chuck Berry, Aretha Franklin, Otis Redding. Two of the only white faces in the crowd, Don and I moved among faces hard set on having a good time. As the crowd got bigger, the music got louder, so loud we couldn't hear each other talk. Words had no place here, neither did our minds. Only our bodies belonged, all of us planted on the same thundering dance floor, moving to the beat, rocking our bones. Vibrations pulsed up from the floor through the soles of my feet to my legs and energized my hips. Sweat and body odors, lotions and perfumes blended in with earthy smoke that Don recognized as pot. I admire dancers' clothes, dark, tight, and sleeveless, or light, loose, and low cut. Hair ranged from straightened to braided to natural. The first time I'd seen afros, hair picked out, creating a crown around their heads. Don's black hair flew wild. I let my wavy hair loose too. A girl with silky hair like Maureen rolled her head, and under the strobes it looked like she had three heads. As one disc ran into the other, our whiteness seemed to be forgotten or fully accepted, and I relaxed in a feeling of freedom. Lights flickered. Another first a strobe and its dizzying effect. All of us, freely moving individuals, forming one throbbing crowd, moved to the same beat. Nothing separating us from the music, its overriding rhythm binding us all.
Thank you. Thank you all. Now, we can open up for Q&A right now. We have some time. So if anyone has any questions, I will discussion, questions?
Cindy, can I show my book cover too?
Sure.
Becca's not the only one.
And then I have mine. Rebellion.
Sorry.
Layover.
We all can show ours.
Yes, absolutely. So, and then talking about the books, we have put on our, with some of our PR, information on where you can buy these books. If you want to buy books from the authors, if you want a signed gift plate, let me know, and I will let each author know, and we can exchange the book plates. The library can be the central location. Just let me know if you'd like it personalized, how you'd like it, what you'd like it to say. For books that you've already bought, or if you buy them online. And if you need contact information or information on where the books are available, I will be glad to send it to you.
Are we all agreed we could share our emails?
If that would be great.
Yeah,
That would be fun.
we started putting information in the chat, so it'd be great if everyone connected.
Yeah, I see that. Thank you. That's great.
You know what I wanted to say, I was telling one of the girls before, there's a thing called Library Bug, where you can, of course, purchase it, but your book is presented in a format that goes to about 10,000 libraries. 2 or 3 picked up mine, and it's also put out on the web and picked up by ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox News. So just put in Google Library Bug, and it's 300, and most of the time she brings it down to 150, and it's a good deal.
Are you saying Library Bub? B-U-B?
Yeah,
Thank you for that information.
very well. Oh, and I also have a blog on lauradelaudio.com that has to do with grieving. If anybody needs it, I'll put the information in.
That would be our helpful resource for today, right?
Right.
There's a
Definitely.
lot of grief. That's what as I mentioned earlier, I wrote from a lens of grief as well with my book, and grief is not just, it comes in different forms. It's not just as a result of a loss of a loved one. It's also from the loss of the life you once knew. And I think that resonates with all of us today with the new norm in which we find ourselves living in.
Well put.
Hopefully there'll be another norm soon.
Yeah.
Hey, Janet and Ken. I also have a son who's a college baseball player. Until a torn labrum kind of put him on the bench for a while. So I totally, your story really resonates with me too, Ken. You went to Binghamton, you said?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's a different division. I don't think you guys would have played.
Where did you go?
Ken.
We played some Ivy League schools out of conference, but I don't know if we played Penn. I can't remember. It was a joke though, because I desperately wanted to go down south. I still every day of my life want to go down south, so I ended up going into the snow belt to play baseball. But that's just the way life works, I guess.
Yeah. Actually, he spent a summer up in Albany too, playing baseball. Number 2.
They're extended.
I don't have any questions, but I want to take the time to commend all the authors for the courage it takes and it took to write your book. And we can see just from the small population we have here, and maybe even from some of your customers and patrons, that we all have a story to tell, and We are more alike than we are different. And don't ever underestimate the power of your words.
You either, Anise. Your book is wonderful. Thank you for writing it.
Thank you.
They go with something.
The library has a writing group, and they meet regularly, and now they're meeting, of course, on Zoom. But we have a new structure, and she leads the group. The writing group, one of the things we always say at the beginning of each session is everybody has a story to tell. Every person has a story to share.
You don't have to be a professional. We've proven that, right? And it didn't have to be a childhood dream. You know, it's, I say, and I've learned in this season of my life that it's never too late to live the life you want to live. And
That's a very positive way of thinking.
Yeah. There's also another writing group called Creative. Oh, I forget the name of it. But if you get the book, Creating Better Characters, there's a writing group on there that is wonderful. It has a lot of resources and a lot of good people. Creating Better Characters. I forget the name of course, the group, but it's creative something. So that helps.
Janet, in your Fairfield County Writers Group, is that, I'm forgetting names, is that with Gabby Coatsworth?
No, this is with Carol Danhauser. You know her?
She was actually my first editor.
Oh, she's amazing. She's very tough, which is good.
Yeah.
And she co-founded that with Tess McGovern.
Right.
And there's men and women part of it, and they bring in publishers, and they bring in writers, and they have lessons, and all different types of writing. And so I learned so much from them, and the camaraderie is wonderful. They have a space you can also rent there to be part of the writers group, and yeah, so it's I just love them.
Yeah.
In
Carol
fact,
is terrific. She's terrific. She did about 3/4 of my book, I think.
yeah, she's really cool. She would say, Janet, I love that last excerpt. You're really getting it. It's really good. And I look at it, all covered with red marks. So that was when she liked it. So there was so much work to do, but she was usually right. 90% of the time.
Yeah, she's great.
I was very moved by the stories of the Holocaust. I think that there's such a it was one of the things that shocked me growing up as a baby boomer. You learn about what happened not so far away, so long ago. I had a lot of Jewish girlfriends, and they still suffer from the trauma of that. Slavery and the trauma of that's coming after all these hundreds of years.
There's case studies done that it's not just their trauma that they suffer from, but it's been passed down from generation to generation. It's internalized and it's in their DNA now.
Epigenetics.
It's genetics, yeah. So that trauma is their stories have become my stories and hopefully, the world stories. But
Wow, that is wonderful.
Yeah, Rebecca, you're absolutely right.
That's exactly what African Americans are experiencing as well. The generational trauma, it continues, and it needs to be acknowledged.
I'm so glad that we're starting now.
Holocaust remembrances recently, and it's on a YouTube video, but recently, last week, a close friend of my family, her daughter, did a presentation for 3GNY Stories, and her name's Elizabeth Kamens, and it was a remembrance of her grandparents, who my parents were very close friends with, who lived here in Norwalk, and it was about how they survived the Holocaust and immigrated to the United States, and it's wonderful. It's a wonderful presentation. It's on YouTube, and I can, recommend it. Her name's Elizabeth Kamens. Her grandparents were Rudolph and Trudy Hers, and they lived in Norwalk.
Those names actually sound familiar to me. I wonder if my grandparents were friendly with them as well. But that's actually the next wave of speakers is the second generation and the third generation, and we've kind of taken their stories on and are presenting them for them because they're either no longer around anymore or they're ill or they're elderly and they can't tell their stories. So with the promotion of my book, I've actually hooked up with the second generation and third generation speaking group, and I've gone out and gone into schools and have spoken. So it's pretty.
Nice.
Yeah, your books open other doors, and
Yeah.
it's great.
And that's one of the wonderful reasons for us to do something like this too, because all of your books open up doors to everyone that's listening. And we're recording this; it's going to be put up. We'll put it up, and people, a lot of our patrons, they come in, they request books, or they hear about books that are on the bestseller list. But it's the independent books that are so important that people need to read, and they need to hear about and have the promotion. And so that we are fortunate that we can do that here at the library, and it gives us great satisfaction.
And, I had something to say about the speaking about the books. For a short time, I was part of actually a decade, I was part of the Speakers Association, National Speakers Association, and through them, I got a lot of speaking engagement. Well, not as many as I wanted, but I got some good ones. And you can make a lot of money speaking if you get to be known. There was one time I spoke. This was the best. This was my dream of what it meant to be a speaker. I was asked to go to Nashville. They paid the airfare. They paid me $5,000 for an hour and a half speech, dinner, hotel. They even shipped in my books and helped sell the books. They videotaped it. I mean, it was the dream, right? And that was rare. And unfortunately, I had to get out of that business soon after that. But it is possible when you think of it. So it's much better way, I think, than trying to sell the book, which is very hard to sell books. But you can make the fees with speaking. And that's not easy either. As I say, it happened rarely, but I know it's out there. So maybe you won't get as much. Maybe you get a few hundred, but that would pay for a lot of books, trying to sell a lot of books. So that's a good avenue to go for, to try to make up for the costs of this of the writing.
Yeah, that's very true. I've become a motivational speaker, and last month I actually shared a virtual stage with Les Brown.
Oh my God!
It was an international speaking event, and so absolutely doors will open.
Congratulations, that's great.
All of you are absolutely right. Before the pandemic, since my book published, I did over 100 presentations. And there are libraries galore who are looking for content, and I love interacting in person with audiences. And of course, all of that came to a screeching halt with the pandemic. But I guess the only upside is that now we can do international events. So I've done 2 in the UK, and a whole bunch in Canada, which is, I guess it's nice, it's Zoom, but I'm so looking forward to getting back to the in-person events. There's nothing like interacting with a live audience. It's more emotional. And as you said, you can sell them.
And we can give refreshments, which we miss.